Welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me for number 2 video in my giant project called What Do I Want My YouTube Channel to Be About? What is this YouTube channel about, this YouTube thingy? So we're going to explore a whole bunch of different cool stuff, cool to me, basically, because it's my channel. And I want to do part 2. I've been talking a lot with my friend ChatGPT, and I'm not going to bring them on as a co-host, but we've been covering some really interesting stuff. So we're looking at the question of, is the news sacred? What, why, where, why would we say that? Oh my God, it just turns out, yeah, heck yeah, it's super sacred. So one of the biggest ways to look at the sacredness is to look at the Constitution of the United States. In the First Amendment, which we're super fond of talking about, it's actually pretty weird language, but it mentions 3 important things: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press. It turns out the people that wrote the Constitution had been living in 2 centuries of the literal opposite of freedom. You could not talk, freedom of press didn't exist. So imagine living in a sort of dictatorship or the reign of a pretty tight royal family or whatever. The king or the queen was a bit of a dictator. They dictated strict rules around what how news could be moved around, what would be said, how it would be moved, stuff like that. And people just had to sort of live like that. So when the people that came here from England established a constitution, they found it important to literally say freedom of the press in the very First Amendment. So one of the ways that I could define sacredness is when you don't have something and you fought for it and you've established it and you owned it and it's yours, it is sacred because you have lived with it, without it, and experienced how uncomfortable that was, how painful, how deadly it was. And so you've sort of lived in a place where you've been able to establish this freedom is so important, we're going to almost make it law. So the fascinating part to me is that we've gone on in our history since that, we've established, I think of it as a protective bubble, right, around the borders of this country. You could look at it I just see it as a big bubble. So humor me with this picture. We've created this bubble. In this bubble, it specifically says, hey, over here, you're free to investigate power, to write about it, to tell people about it. We're going to move information from point A to point B in on YouTube, on Instagram, on TikTok, on the news, on CNN. We're gonna be able to broadcast information, whether it's newspaper or whatever, and we're free to do that. We don't have to ask permission. All we have to do is be brave and not make ties with the people we're investigating or the people that we're sort of finding newsworthy. You don't want to become biased. So we've established this bubble way back in the beginning of our country, that news is sacred in that respect. And then we've gone on, after establishing that bubble, to have different ways of having news. In fact, I've talked about in my first video, there were definitely periods around the Civil War is a really good example where literally newspapers were biased. They were partisan. You could make small newspapers fairly easily, and you would have a firm stance on how you felt. This newspaper looks at certain things this way, and this newspaper looks at certain things this way. So everybody had a voice. They took advantage of that First Amendment, the freedom of press, but there wasn't any neutrality. So we've come away from hey, we really want to establish this freedom. And then maybe we've gone into places where, oh my God, we're living through a time where using that freedom isn't very meaningful because we're not really talking about truth. We're really talking about opinions. So that has become, I think, a huge topic in the last, from around the Civil War era. We started the establishment of the Associated Press, which is like another fascinating thing I'll probably do. We'll talk about that next. But you've got an era then that comes out of a very biased era, and we're going, oh my gosh, we have been living in a news bubble that is really about opinions, and it's about a tug of war between sides. Now we have to establish neutrality and truth because we haven't had that. So we have to get that into the mix. So I've said, like, I feel like I kind of came out of the womb. I was probably in the womb, exposed to the news, listening to Walter Cronkite and some of the other big anchors that were telling the truth and finding a humble power in being able to talk about what was happening in the world, what was happening in the country through some very intense times for this country, but being very respected. Like, people did not want to miss the 6 o'clock news. It was important. So you find, like, you want to establish freedom of the press, and then you get to play under that. What does that mean? You get to do all this weird stuff. You get to make up whatever you want, right? And then people don't respect that. People intuitively know at some point, this isn't going well. We got to find the truth, the facts, and only the facts. And then you're kind of riding that wave, exploring what that means for maybe the next couple 100 years or 100 years, I think, or so. And then you come into the present and you've got a lot going on. You've got the AI coming in. You've got social media. Everybody can turn on a camera. You can call news whenever you want. So one of the fun things I did look at today was what happened in different societies to spread news. So in ancient Rome, for example, what did they do in Rome? Let's move on to the Incas, since I don't have that fresh in my mind. So during the period where the Incas were had established a very powerful society, which frankly sounds amazing. I need to do more research on that. They actually used rope and knots to move information. So they would, it had a lot to do with, like, the census. So it's more informative and less personal. Like, oh, my neighbor got married, and my other friend down the street passed away. So that kind of news maybe wasn't spread this way. But, like, if you wanted to do a census in one city, you would then take a rope and tie knots in it, and then you would run that to a more central city where they would get to count the knots and understand, like, okay, there's so many people. So it's, like, really interesting and strange. There are people that even communicated with smoke. So, like, the blanking on that, but the smoke thing, doing the motion. Also, we looked a little bit into who's doing news right now. That's really interesting. And it turns out that Japan is doing a lot of interesting things. They're using technology a lot. And there's channels, not only is there news, but there's news in the big capital, like, quote unquote news. So you've got, like, sort of the professional news organizations, and then you've got people that have established YouTube channels and other types of channels where they're interacting more with people. They're bringing different things like games into it, but also games that have a lot of value. And they're just sort of like, it's more of like the everyday human that's talking about what the big guys are talking about, and also what's more local, and also what's more educational. So mixing that up and creating huge platforms. Like, I looked at one of those channels that was over 2 million subscribers on that channel. One of the more exciting things was in Finland, they do a lot of community news. So they don't have the same pictures that we have of what the news was. I think possibly because there was a big fight from the people who were the colonists that were leaving England. There was a big fight to establish their sovereignty, establish their rights of freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. They wanted those things real bad at the cost of almost everything. They were willing to fight for those things. So I think that creates a foundation here where the news is very, very, like my picture is like, it's very strong. It's very powerful. It's like very like, I don't know. It's just, it's, in Finland, where that country has been, established for hundreds of years, they don't have that same picture that we have. So there's a lot of news that has to do with the community. The community's super involved. There's a lot of community radio. People are listening. And I love that idea that you decide what's valuable, and you don't have to be afraid to shine a light on like things happening in your immediate community versus like, oh, in New York this happened, or in Chicago, and like the larger cities and the more established places. But like life is happening right here, and it doesn't have to be a major scale. It doesn't have to be, I don't know what the picture is. It doesn't have to be something in order to be newsworthy. So it's lovely to think about the news as bringing people together, maybe, some laughter, maybe the everyday living is more, there's more warmth around it. There's more connection around it. So people aren't, people are still seen, but like, you don't have to be super special to be seen. And I think I'm going to end it on that. I did do a little bit of research into the Associated Press, but not enough. So I'll come back to that. I also am curious about women, what news women has established, and just this idea of this idea that news. I think we've been circling it for a long time. Like, what is news? That question. I think the news is sacred. I think people have been bringing information from point A to point B for a long time. There's been town criers, even like people have been walking through. I think it's right when darkness falls. If you're a crier, you're going to walk through the town. This is like hundreds of years ago. You're going to walk through the town and make announcements. So Samuel L. Taylor died today. Samuel L. Taylor and Wendy and Joseph were married today. You're going to make announcements of things that have been happening so that you get the news. It's wild. It's so cool. Oh my God, I love it. Anyway, so we're looking at, okay, so what is news? And I just think it'd be really fun to kind of mix it up a little, like have community, have like cool artists. Like we have so much available to us right now with these different social media platforms. That you can see people doing incredible stuff, but maybe your community doesn't know about that. So if you start a channel and start investigating and decide what's newsworthy and even bring some of the bigger news stories in, I don't know, sounds like a melting pot. It sounds like fun to me. All right, thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back.